Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, consultant, and I'll be your host. Today, I'm joined by the most amazing investigative journalist and author, Kevin J. Mooney, and he's here to discuss his new book and maybe a few other related articles. Now, the book title, Climate Porn, is a bit controversial, and perhaps we can discuss why that title was chosen. But first, welcome to the program, Kevin.
Hey, Tammy, thanks for having me. Really appreciate being here, and thanks for all that you're doing.
Thank you. Would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Sure, of course. Kevin Mooney. I am an investigative journalist based in Washington, D.C. I've worked with a variety of national publications. I'll name a few: Washington Examiner, National Review, Washington Times, the Daily Signal, which was started by the Heritage Foundation. And most recently, I've joined a new outfit called Restoration News, a subset of a larger company called Restoration of America. And the title of that outfit kind of says itself. It's with an eye toward 250 years of American independence and freedom. We hope there's an opportunity here to restore the old Constitution. So in a nutshell, that's what I'm trying to do, is cover angles in journalism that are helpful toward that cause of removing the barnacles of this unelected administrative state off of the old historical Constitution. And that kind of led me in the direction of looking into the climate movement. And that's why I saw an opening to do this book.
Yeah, you make an excellent point there about the barnacles of these sort of regulatory structures that sort of pull down or bog down the Constitution and in many ways undermine it, as well as the economy. Now, what I find so interesting about the title of your book is you have this really long subtitle, which I'm going to read out here.
Sure.
It says, "How and Why Anti-Population Zealots Fabricate Science While Targeting American Capitalism, Freedom, and Independence." That really says a lot of what you're trying to explore here in the book. But before we get into the meat of the conversation, I'm wondering if you could share with the audience what inspired the title, and how does that analogy hold up when discussing the sort of impacts of climate activism and climate alarmism on public policy and the public discourse?
Yeah, well, no, that's a great question. And the short answer is it's a way to weave together several themes in the book. But the longer answer is, I sort of dropped that in there as a joke almost in one of the chapters about education. And this came out of during the COVID shutdowns. I was investigating what kind of curriculum that was being taught in public schools that led to outrage among parents, and rightly so. We were looking at, for the first, I would say the one good thing about the COVID shutdowns, which, by the way, took stage direction from the climate movement. That's where they got their initial inspiration for all those shutdown programs. But in any event, in tandem with that investigation, I found that there was also a movement to teach about climate science. I put that in quotations because the movement among public schools was to divorce students from the scientific method, to be told there is no debate about what causes climate change, that the ending is already there, and it's up to you to coerce, and that the process doesn't matter. You get to whatever desired outcome the politicians want to get, which of course turns the scientific method on its head. So to me, that was a pornographic approach to science, just as conventional pornography is the distortion of the natural act. So I seized on that as initially sort of a sub-theme that really became the overarching theme. Climate science is not normal science. It's not about the scientific method. It's about a political agenda and a distortion of science. And I would say the good news, which I try to flesh out in this book, is you have a growing number of independently funded scientists who are able to tell the truth about what climate science actually says without being hindered by government spending.
That's a really great point. I listened to Tom Nelson's podcast, and he has a steady stream of people, of scientists who, people sometimes say, why is it always these older scientists who are retired or whatever who are speaking out, and why didn't they speak out earlier? I think there's a few who were speaking out all the time, but there's others who, given how science has been sort of perverted in many ways, that you're unable to speak because you would be losing your publication routes, you'd be losing grants, and probably lose your job, as we found with Judith Curry and others.
Right.
Who were harassed into retirement or leaving and doing something else. Roger Pilkey Jr. also is
Yes.
someone who was harassed relentlessly. And so with that in mind, and what you said there about how you wish to kind of frame it, what did you want to accomplish with this book?
Well, I see a bit of an opening and an opportunity here. Yes, you're right. A lot of the scientists were unwilling or unable to speak out because I think of the relationship between government and the academic institutions. So you're not going to get any more grants unless you help rationalize their way into more regulations and greater government control over the private sector. So that's the whole point of the grant. Tell us what we want to hear in terms of climate so we can go out and regulate the private industry. And I saw an opening here because, over time, the science has caught up. I think it's one of the big themes of this book. There's all kinds of new studies coming out that show you, I'll discuss just a few, but there's several of them showing that the warming that we've experienced since the early 20th century is mostly natural influences. And on top of that, it's been actually somewhat beneficial in terms of animal and plant life and agriculture across the planet. So the whole premise of the whole alarmist movement was wrong right from the beginning. But like I say, it was the assault on the scientific method that I think was most scandalous. So you have groups standing outside of the academy and out of government that can stand on their own 2 feet with public funding to really get the message out about what the climate actually says. That's helpful because then it helps us to sort of drive home the point that the premise of this regulatory regime is flawed and dishonest right from the beginning. So I see an opportunity here for us to sort of, like I say, yank off those barnacles that unelected fourth. We have 3 branches of government. The executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. But this 4th branch emerged during the progressive era that I think really seized on the climate agenda to really grow and expand their power. And I see some encouraging movements back in the direction of constitutionalism. That's why I think the timing was right for this book, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, and the idea that the Constitution was set up to secure pre-existing natural rights. Unlike the United Nations, the government doesn't create rights in the American and the British system. I mean, you have pre-existing natural rights that the government is erected supposedly to secure and protect. Remember, whatever the government gives out, it can always take away. So what I'm hoping is that we see a little bit of an awakening, and I think the public is becoming more attuned to how dangerous the climate agenda was. It has nothing to do with the climate, nothing to do with the environment, everything I think to do with government control.
That's an excellent point. I was reading I'm trying to, I have it here, the Routledge Handbook on
Oh yeah
of the climate change movement, and it was written, I think it was published in 2019, maybe. I think it was before COVID it came out. And one of the fascinating, actually it was first published in 2014, then republished in 2016, 2018. What they pointed out in that book was that the environmental movement didn't always, the climate movement didn't like to talk with the environmental movement, that there was this kind of schism because they had different goals. And I think that goes to precisely what you just said about altering the entire societal structure, anti-capitalist, and so on and so forth, that it's not about the environment, it's not about protecting whales or birds or nature, it's about something else. And there needs to be a distinction there between what's real environmentalism, protecting the whales, protecting the insects, protecting bees and all these other things, not using them as an excuse to stop development. And it's like the only time the climate movement seems to engage with the environmental side is when they can use it in order to stop something, like whether it's protecting a lizard or protecting the ocean smelt or some other thing. That's the only time they care, because when the windmills are up and they're slaughtering birds and insects and everything, they get a pass. Suddenly the environment, the animals don't matter. And I thought you did a really excellent job in outlining that division there. When there's real, you start, I think, with the story about the whales on the East Coast there, and if you could just maybe expand a little bit on
Sure.
what you found with that story.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's a very important point, and I think that also gets back to a reframing of the debate here. At some point, the so-called climate movement hijacked the environmental movement. I think that's part of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
I can't say exactly when that happened. I'll go back to the first Earth Day, maybe in 1970, when catastrophic claims began to reemerge or began to emerge for the first time, in contradiction to what the environmental agenda was. There is a long, honorable history of conservation and environmentalism in the states and throughout the broader international community to preserve wildlife, preserve open spaces, conservation. But at some point, this command and control approach took over. I think driven by climate alarmism, by the climate movement, so that the efforts made in terms of preservation, in terms of species and habitat, ran smack into the climate alarmist movement. That story about offshore wind, I think, is very telling because what I see is a broad cross section of Americans, both parties, sort of apolitical people who want to preserve their shoreline, want to preserve their property values, want to preserve the fishing industry, want to preserve the tourism industry, want to preserve the environment. And who are they running into? But these well-funded climate activist groups that say, oh no, everything has to be sacrificed in the name of climate change, that these offshore winds, they may cause some short-term damage, but it's worth it in exchange for long-term climate benefits. And then when you read through the environmental impact statements that the federal government puts out, they acknowledge that it's not going to have any impact on the environment. So the question becomes, what is the motivation? Follow the money. I think it's about lining the pockets of well-heeled special interests. Also, there's a foreign angle, making the United States more dependent on foreign sources of energy. That's, let's not forget where some of those parts for wind and solar come from. They come from communist China, so let's not lose sight of that. But you're right. I do think there's sort of a rubber meets the road moment here. One of the groups I work with saved Long Beach Island. Now, for my own selfish reasons, that's one of my favorite beaches. I don't want the offshore wind going in to ruin my beaches, but none of us want that. And along the way, we have uncovered between the engineers and the scientists who are part of that coalition how much damage the offshore wind has done to the whale species, the marine life. I mean, the correlation is just kind of inescapable. They are now lobbying for a protective corridor for the migration pattern for the right whale, which the offshore wind would be lined up sort of in tandem with that corridor. And it's a rubber meets the road moment because I think the climate activists are going to have to drop the mask. Do we care about the whales or do we care about offshore wind? So I think it's to become very clear and very evident who the real environmentalists are. But as I say, I think the upshot is that you do see like a reawakening of traditional environmentalism. The free market people are the environmentalists. We are the conservationists. The climate activists are not. And the offshore wind is one of several examples of that. Another example I'll point out too out west are some of the ranchers, who are constantly, under the Trump administration, this has changed a bit. So it's more of a fair fight. So you don't have all these special interests, dialed into the government agency so they can just bully property owners. But I always ask myself, think about it logically. What rancher is going to want to go out and ruin his own property? They want it pristine. I mean, so, you don't have to burn too many brain cells to see that the whole premise of this is wrong. And it's just about government control and seizing private property. So that's a 1-2 punch I'll throw out there. Number one, the folks fighting offshore wind, but also I think the ranchers and the property owners out west who are fighting against these well-funded environmental litigators. So I'm not ready to say the tide is turned, but I think the mask is dropped and eyes are wide open.
Yes, that's a great point. I don't think the tide has turned also, but as you say, more people are becoming aware of it and becoming aware of the sort of the disconnect between the rhetoric and what the reality is. And
Right.
like, let me give you an example in the UK. So there's a group called Natural England or Nature England that was set up in 2008 by the government as sort of a quango here, where it's like a quasi government organization. And they have been the group behind the delays to the nuclear power plant Hinkley Point, where they instituted all these different rules and regulations to protect a fish because of the water coming in for the reactor and then going out. And it's just kind of dragged things out forever. And now their latest thing is there's a rare breed of pony on in Dartmoor, in the moors in Dartmoor. Mm-hmm. And they're like, in order to protect the moor, we got to slaughter 95% of this endangered semi-wild pony that's been there for thousands of years. So it's like, you say you're for Nature England, you say you're for all that is preserving nature in
Mhm.
England, but you only care when it affects if you can stymie development. And I thought that was such a telling example of this disconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. There is, I mean, there's room for responsible productivity and development that is not incompatible with environmentalism. And the
Yeah.
climate slash, modern version of environmentalists want to shut it all down. They view humanity as a blight to the planet. That's why I have that angle in there about anti-population zealots, because people ask me, well, where does this movement really come from? Well, I think there's a long history. I think it is an anti-human, anti-population movement. That's what's trailing at the bottom of it. That humanity is a blight to the planet and we're a disease. That gets down to all the regulations targeting CO2. If you want to control humanity, well, what better way to do it than to declare CO2 a pollutant, which is a way of saying that human beings are pollutants. All these things sort of fit together. My great hope is this book starts to unpackage that a little bit, to let people know that, in Julian Simon fashion, people are the ultimate resource. We can be an asset to the planet. We can actually improve the environment. We can raise living standards with our innovation and productivity. So, but the movement standing in the way is the climate movement, which has a lot of money and organizations standing behind it, which is why I say, I don't think the climate industrial complex is dead yet. I think it's been set back a bit. I think it's a little bit more of a fair fight now, but this movement is still up and running, and there's still a lot of money and organization out there to attack the capitalist system and to empower centralized planners.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to say I think you're an excellent storyteller and investigator, and I really appreciated how you backed up real people vignettes with a great deal of research and sources. And if people look at this book and say, "Oh, there's so many pages," it's actually divided into real bite-sized stories. So there's 16 chapters that cover different aspects. And I was reading along and it was like, wow, suddenly I'm halfway done the book, and it just zoomed by really fast. And I commend you for being able to do that, to tell the stories, bring in the personal anecdotes, and humanize what's happening instead of looking at it from a sort of neutral policy aspect where everything is kind of anonymized. But and I really appreciated how you did that.
Oh, well, thanks. That's the kind of thing an author likes to hear. And in some ways, it is a book about victims. I'm trying to tell the story of people who've been victimized by this climate beast, whether it's property owners, scientists, honest academics. There's a long and copious list of victims, and hopefully we won't have to go through that kind of experience again.
I wanted to highlight one of the victims that you talked about, which is seniors as a victim of ESG investing.
Oh.
And you talk about how that ESG is not there to maximize profits, but rather to create new avenues for anti-capitalist policies. And I'm wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit. How are seniors a victim to this ESG investing direction?
Yeah, well, let me make sure I'm saying that. It's environmental, social, and governance, green nonsense kinds of investments. And I think part of what happens, especially with seniors, the folks managing these retirement investments have a fiduciary responsibility to the people who are putting their lifetime earnings to turn a profit and so that they don't outlive their money. But if you're allowing political correctness or fashionable green schemes to carry the day, well, then by definition, you're not looking to maximize profits. You're looking to invest in something that may not be profitable, but is sort of politically fashionable. Which means that seniors, when they have their backs turned, are going to be confronted with diminishing investments, because these green investment schemes don't compare anywhere close to the S&P 500 or anything with companies that are serious about turning a profit. So, yeah, I think it's a great disservice to the folks, especially older people, who have to rely on these investments. We were talking earlier about younger people who might be more attuned to different trends and schemes and have their eyes open to it. But you reach a certain age and you're really dependent on who is managing your investments, and that's why I'm glad to see the people on my side of the table become more involved in shareholder activism. I think that's one reason why ESG has lost its luster a little bit, at least in the States. I think it was in August 2024 that Larry Fink with BlackRock, who was all in with ESG, has done an about face. I think really just for raw mercenary financial reasons. So I would say that he's doing the right thing, maybe for cynical reasons, but at least he's coming around a bit. Unfortunately, I think you folks in Europe have gone much further down that road than we have with ESG.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we saw the results of that with the recent British Petroleum shareholder meetings, where the activist investors basically probably had the chairman removed, because he was sort of rolling back a lot of the sort of environmental social governance things.
Yeah.
Didn't want to have to report quite so much under the climate disclosures, which they objected to. So yeah, I think in the UK and EU, it's still there. They're still tripling down on it, and they're mandating a lot of the disclosures now. And for the audience who doesn't follow all this arcane stuff, the climate disclosures are where companies have to explain how they're reducing their impacts on the environment, what their emissions are throughout their supply chains, what their plans are to reduce it and to be in compliance with the net zero targets, whether it's 2030, 2035, 2050, and whatnot. So yeah, it's still full steam ahead in the EU and the UK. But the thing is, when the United States does something, they are such a big force in the world that people could start to look at that and say, hey, look, they're prospering by not following this stuff. Maybe we should reconsider. And I think it gives people hope.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it comes down to that rare creature, corporate entities with spines. But there are a handful of American CEOs who I think might be willing to say to the Europeans, we are not going to play by these rules, and we'll take our toys and go elsewhere, rather than being restricted with our investment opportunities with all your different disclosure rules. And as you and I discussed before, there was a proposal from the Biden SEC that would have had these very onerous disclosure requirements. Fortunately, it was killed in its cradle, but that concept, thanks to Michael Bloomberg and others, still lives in Europe. And hopefully there'll be an awakening. I can't think of any major party in Europe that is, except for maybe the Reform Party in Great Britain, that is pushing back hard against some of these green schemes. But I think it will happen at some point.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the rubber hits the road at some point. There's when the economy is crumbling even more than it already is, and things become so expensive. Unfortunately, people will suffer along the way, and one can only hope that they see the light before it's too late. Can you go, in your book, you talk about Mike Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies and his, huge conglomerate of the Bloomberg terminal and whatnot. And you suggest there that he had a financial motive to be pursuing all of these things because he was the one who set up the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD. He's a UN Special Envoy. He was best friends with Mark Carney in setting up all of these different things, and his company benefits. So could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think he ran for president too. So he's all those things. If you look at the Biden SEC, and by the way, I think it's with the Biden administration that this movement really hit its apex, thankfully for a short period of time. But the Biden Securities and Exchange Council, I think, essentially took stage direction from Bloomberg and his companies in terms of how to craft this proposed SEC disclosure rule, where companies would have to disclose their emissions, even if it's indirect or secondhand or coming from places overseas. And of course, the Bloomberg terminal would be the terminal that would be used as a vehicle for these disclosure requirements. So he was essentially trying to write the new securities law that would benefit his company handsomely. There was all kinds of incestuous conflicts of interest. And that really begins with his platform in the United Nations. And I should add too, that's in tandem with the whole climate movement to create a new revenue stream for the United Nations. So I think that's really what Bloomberg's motivation was. Number one, to benefit his company, and number two, to empower and inflate the influence of the United Nations, where he himself continues to occupy a pretty big platform. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. There's all kinds of incestuous relationships here. Like I say, follow the money. It has nothing to do with the climate as such, and everything to do with well-heeled special interests and an attack on the capitalist system, which says to me that Mike Bloomberg is not really a capitalist. Not really. He's someone who very much wants more government control over the private sector, where he can call the shots.
Yeah. I mean, he was responsible. He was the one who spearheaded, when he was mayor of New York, the C40 Cities initiative.
Oh, right.
Then he spearheaded the We're Still In coalition, which was during the first Trump administration, where it was all these cities and states who were like, no, we're not out of the Paris Agreement. We're still in it. And they've rebranded now, but they're doing it again. His philanthropies also supported the Beyond Coal initiative.
Right.
And I think now it's the Beyond Petrochemicals is the going after plastics and stuff. I think that's the one. So his philanthropies have been involved in various elements, underwriting to great effect, actually. A lot of these studies, environmental groups, and policy initiatives, all to undermine American energy, really reliable energy.
Yeah, I mean, and that was I think the whole point of the Paris Climate Agreement was to constrain and restrict American domestic energy production and make us more reliant on these foreign sources. Bloomberg was certainly part of that overall strategy, I think. I will say that's one of the great achievements of the Trump administration, is to get us out of not of just the Paris Agreement, but the entire UN treaty framework going back to the early 90s that got us into all these climate agreements. I would say just that one move by itself, I think, makes the entire Trump presidency worthwhile. And he did it this time. The second time he did it by, like I say, getting out of the UN framework so that a future administration cannot simply reinsert us back in there. They'd have to go through the U.S. Senate and get a 2/3 vote, which is extremely unlikely to have us reattach ourselves to these UN climate agreements. So yeah, that to me marked a major turning point, much to the consternation of the Michael Bloombergs in the United Nations.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was such a brilliant move, and I'm glad that Trump followed that advice because it was the 1992 Rio Agreement that really,
right,
put this all kind of set the ball rolling, as it were. In your book, you do a really effective job of pulling together lots of these different threads that we've been talking about, that many people just kind of see in isolation. You talk about litigation from groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council. Then you link that to the policy work of think tanks like the Rocky Mountain Institute and the World Resources Institute. Then you bring in how they use input from the Union of Concerned Scientists, which then they leveraged coverage of studies in places like Nature. And then you then talk about the climate finance that can cut off capital or insurance for companies that don't tie the line. Now, all of these different groups seem to be pursuing coordinated lines of attack through research, policy advocacy, litigation, and so on. And you provided some really interesting research there about the NRDC and the World Resources Institute and their relationship with China. And I'm wondering, it seems like this is quite a sophisticated network operating kind of in concert, often with funding streams that have Chinese connections. What do you make of this ecosystem? Is it more coordinated than coincidental?
I think it's largely coordinated. I'll just highlight one. There's an outfit called the Energy Foundation based in San Francisco. It should be called the Anti-Energy Foundation, but they call themselves the Energy Foundation. They have a spin-off group called the Energy Foundation China, which is largely based in Beijing. All their personnel are Beijing people, former Communist Party members. I don't distinguish between the Communist government and the Beijing government and the Communist Party. Between the Energy Foundation China and the Energy Foundation, they receive these different financial grants from overseas, from China. They're repackaged. I would even say laundered in some way, but the point is you have these pass-through organizations, including the Energy Foundation China, that in turn fund these environmental litigators inside the United States. So between the Energy Foundation China, Tides Foundation is another one I'll throw in there, Sea Change Foundation, these are all entities that receive money from overseas that they then reload in the form of grants that go to groups, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Council, Sierra Club. Those groups in turn file lawsuits against American energy companies to stymie American energy production, to block natural gas pipelines, to fund demonstrations, and any kind of litigation that can gum up the works for domestic American energy production. So yeah, there is a coordinated stream here. To put simply, it's lawfare. Communist China and also Russia too have been using green pressure groups based in the United States to attack our American energy sector with an eye toward disrupting our energy sector from China's point of view to make us more dependent on supply chains from China, wind and solar, critical minerals resources that are mostly available in China, and to put the kibosh on American oil and gas development. And that movement gained some serious traction during the Obama and Biden years. You mentioned the NRDC, and I go through this in the book. I mean, I'm talking here about energy companies. The Natural Resources Defense Council has also filed lawsuits against the U.S. military in the name of environmentalism. That you can't do these sonar exercises off the coast because it'll harm the whales. Back then, they were concerned about the whales. If you do, they don't care about China doing sonar exercises, but somehow American naval exercises are going to be detrimental toward marine life and whale life. And so there was a case that even went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and thankfully the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Navy. But you can see the time and effort and resources put into the lawfare efforts versus military readiness, which is part of the strategy. NRDC is the tip of the end of the spear. The Environmental Defense Fund is another one. Sierra Club. I can go down the list, but the answer to your question is yes. That money comes from overseas. It goes into those huge foundations. That money then goes into environmental litigators. So we are up against it. I think the Trump administration is at least awakened to the problem, and there's been some serious pushback. But I would say one thing we need to do is reform our own environmental laws so you don't have these big gaping holes for litigators just to drive a truck through.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point, especially if you could maybe explain a little more. What can the average citizen do if they see something happening like this in their jurisdiction, in their community? What could the average citizen do?
They can let their elected officials know that they're watching, and that you might have well-funded vocal groups that are trying to block anti-energy initiatives. But that, in the words of Richard Nixon, it's the silent majority that's very much on the side of affordability, reliable sources of energy, and responsible development. So I would say the average citizen needs to get in the ear of their elected officials and not leave the playing field open to what is a minority. And, there's the phrase useful idiots. There are some, naive do-gooders who are becoming useful idiots, and there are others who are much more complicit in what's happening. So there's sort of, there's both involved. But I would say it's up to average citizens. It doesn't take that much to push back. It really doesn't. Show up at your council meetings, get in the ear of your elected officials, let them know that you're watching and that you favor, responsible energy development, that you like the idea of a pipeline coming out of the Marcellus Shale to raise living standards for rural communities across the states. And that, oh, by the way, those pipelines have a much smaller environmental footprint than all the offshore wind and big wind and solar schemes that the environmentalists or climate activists support. So it's a 1-2 punch that, number one, we are the environmentalists and the conservationists. And at the same time, we do believe in American ingenuity and developing our own resources, and we're watching. So that's what average citizens can do, that they can't just be couch potatoes. They have to go out and fight a little bit.
Excellent. That's some great advice, and I hope people will be able to do that. One of the groups that you talk about in the book is the World Resources Institute, and I think a lot of people haven't heard about it. And they actually have a great deal of global funding from governments all over the world. Why is this organization important in understanding the sort of climate policies that are being pushed in the United States, and how that's affecting national security?
Yeah, they're a group that deserves a lot more attention. Like I said, the NRDC has been exposed somewhat. They've been identified as potential, well, I think they are foreign agents, but they've come under congressional scrutiny for their close ties to China. The World Resources Institute, not as much, but they should be. They're very adept and skilled at burrowing into U.S. government agencies when friendly administrations are in power. I'll go back to the Obama administration. I mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement. For all intents and purposes, that agreement by itself really was an international treaty. And here in the U.S., it's the U.S. Senate that has to approve international treaties. But former personnel who worked with the World Resources Institute, which then went to work for the Obama State Department, came up with legal strategies to find a way not to call this a treaty. That way, so the World Resources Institute, which has come under some scrutiny for its ties to China too, not as blatant as the NRDC, but believe me, they exist. So think about that for a minute. You have a pressure group with former employees placed inside the Obama State Department who are giving advice on how to make an end run around our democratic institutions to get into the Paris Climate Agreement. To say, call it this, call it that, and then you can just avoid a vote in the U.S. Senate. It's very interesting to me how anti-democratic, small d, the climate movement really is. That we don't want democratic deliberation. We want to make an end run around the elected institutions and just coerce these policies into place. And the World Resources Institute was a very big player in that. And of course, they had a compliant administration at the time too that helped. They don't have that now. But that's why in this book I say I don't know if what we're seeing now is just a speed bump along the way to the end of the republic, or if we're looking at a permanent trajectory change. I think that in part that depends on whether we stay independent and free of these UN agreements, or if we can be coerced back into it. And I just don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know that in your book you talked about how both the World Resources Institute and the NRDC have formal registration under Chinese government oversight. Would you say that's a correct characterization?
Well, they have close ties with the Beijing government. There is a law here in the U.S. called the Foreign Agent Registration Act, or FARA for short. Now, the ironic thing about that is it was during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, that the Trump administration opponents tried to use FARA to go after Trump officials who had relations in Ukraine and et cetera. Well, the turnabout came under Obama when finally some Republicans, opened up their eyes and says, wait a minute, maybe we can use that FARA law and say that these groups are violating foreign agent registration requirements, which they clearly are. I think Earth Justice did finally capitulate and register as a foreign agent for all the lobbying they were doing on behalf of foreign governments. The NRDC, World Resources Institute, Sierra Club, they've all denied being foreign agents, but I say keep the pressure on. And the good news there too is it's not just the federal law. There's now state FARA laws that are going into place that are starting to complicate the legal terrain in a good way for all these green pressure groups. So I would say what I would like to see is a more forceful push from the Trump Department of Justice to go after these groups while they're in power and put some teeth into that law. So, so that whenever you see the NRDC in print, you will say the National Resources Defense Council, a registered foreign agent of China, says it's a bad idea for us to develop the Marcellus Shale. Well, then hopefully, that can open the public's eyes to what the real dynamic is.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I know if I'm being a devil's advocate here, the counter argument is that groups like World Resources Institute, NRDC, Greenpeace, who are in China advising the climate policies of the Communist Chinese Party, that they're unable to push back, otherwise they will lose their point of influence, and that their influence is helping China set its climate plans and facilitate reducing their emissions and all these other things. What do you make of that defense? Is it a reasonable trade-off, or does it ultimately undermine the integrity of the broader sort of climate agenda by having that close tie with the Communist Chinese Party?
Yeah, well, once again, it's a classic example of the difference between climate activists and genuine environmentalists. China is the world's #1 polluter. So if they're advising China on environmental policy, they're doing a piss poor job of it. Also, wink, wink, nod, nod, where's the concern about the environment when China's tearing up the islands in the Pacific to turn them into these military platforms and to wreak havoc across the ecology? Throughout parts of China. So no, I don't buy that. I think they're just there to give cover to China. That's their MO. And the fact that they're still there says to me that they succumbed to Beijing. So, I wouldn't take them seriously until they were kicked out.
No, one of the key points that you make in the book is that energy security strengthens national security. And when you talked about the offshore wind, there's quite a big security angle to that. And I think a lot of the documentation related to the Department of Defense or Department of War now, their reports explaining why it's a bad idea to put the offshore wind turbines, a lot of that is still classified. But you provided an intriguing discussion that their concerns is that there's radar and other interference from the wind turbines. That's a national security risk offshore. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, the Trump administration is beginning to move aggressively on this to try to shut down the offshore wind, all in the name of national security. So I'm glad to see the Trump Interior Department and other relevant agencies step up to that. There's a long history here. I'll just mention the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, one of the largest naval bases in the world, maybe the largest. I'm not sure, but it's big. And they have complained for years about how offshore wind diminishes the effectiveness of their sonar exercises, their ability to communicate with their own ships, to detect other ships off our coast. So the offshore wind, I mean, if I was, in charge of strategy in China, and I was trying to ship parts over to the U.S., making use of all the parts we put into offshore wind and so-called renewable resources. Think about, in the cowboys and Indian era, there would be a cactus for the Indian to hide behind, if you will. So the offshore wind, unfortunately, does gum up the works for Navy sonars. Also, the NORAD early defense system, one of the offshore wind platforms up off the coast of New York, has been disrupting Air Force bases that have that early defense warning. So there really is no in between here. Either we prioritize national security or we succumb to these green offshore wind schemes. So yeah, it's not just that they're not good for the environment, but also on top of that, they're disruptive to our military. The other thing they can do too, we've had tests that show that offshore wind can be used to disguise and camouflage drones coming in nearby, maybe to do surveillance or something even more nefarious. Also keep in mind too, that I think there was a story in Reuters about this, but workers who were installing Chinese-made solar energy in parts out west found surveillance technology inside of some of that solar equipment. So if the Chinese can do that with their solar equipment, why not wind equipment? So I do think the national security concern, for a couple of reasons. Number one, they can be used to camouflage submarines off our coast and also to camouflage drones. We have state-of-the-art, superb radar facilities, but you can see where the offshore wind is going to prevent them from really achieving their maximum ability to safeguard the American homeland. So I think the national security concerns are real. That's still working its way up to the court, and hopefully that's something the Trump administration can resolve while it's still in power.
Yeah, time's running out.
Yeah, we can get into the next few election cycles, man. We've seen a real good course correction in the energy and environmental sector, and also a boost to American military readiness. I mean, the conflict in Iran, I think, certainly points to how important and how effective American energy independence has been. We're not relying on foreign entities to project American military power. You can't separate our ability to be a domestic energy producer from our ability to project American military power. They go together. And I think that conflict in Iran really demonstrates that. So, but like I say, is this a temporary course adjustment, or is this something more enduring? I think we need more than just this second Trump administration to make some permanent changes.
Yeah, for sure. One of the interesting things is that the UK and the EU have pushed ahead with massive offshore wind buildouts, even though there's been these warnings from military experts.
Yeah.
I think it was Sweden had put the kibosh on an expansion of some offshore wind. I'm trying to remember off their one coast, and their defense experts came in and said, "Look, this is making us vulnerable to Russia bringing ships and subs and whatever else in." But why do you think they're still pushing ahead, even though there's these warnings?
Well, the simple answer is because they're Europeans, and it takes a long time for them to wake up. That's the simple answer. The other answer is there's probably a financial angle. There's somebody benefiting from the money going into offshore wind, and there's all kinds of relationships behind the scenes with the political class. So that's part of it. But I do think the overreaching of Mother Russia is going to push the Europeans to the brink. So I think just as we're seeing an awakening here, I think it is going to happen in Europe at some point. But because the Europeans, it takes them longer.
Yes, sad to say that is true. I want to just kind of pivot a little bit. This is related to your book, but it's an article that you published recently. You co-wrote. It was on Real Clear Energy about the reference manual on scientific evidence, where you argue that judges are being exposed to politically motivated science through this updated version. Can you explain this issue and why it's important?
Yeah, it's a little complicated, but it's critically important. One of the most important initiatives of the Trump administration is to repeal the endangerment finding. That was the phony finding under the Obama administration that declared CO2 a pollutant, which it's not. It's the great elixir of life. It's essential to life on Earth. But that endangerment finding has been used as the justification for all these climate regulations that have gone in since that time. Lee Zeldin, the EPA administrator, says he has a figure out there saying that if they can repeal the endangerment finding, it'll save American taxpayers something like $1.5 trillion. Whatever the number is, it's one of the largest deregulatory efforts in all of American history. And it could have real positive reverberations. So it's not surprising that you have a bunch of green litigators trying to fight this Trump EPA effort to repeal the endangerment finding. In tandem with that, what we see is a rewrite of this judicial manual. I have to say, I'm sorry, I can't recall the name of the manual, but it's an older manual. And the manual itself is a great tool. It's a manual that has judges stick to the scientific method when they're dealing with, how they admit evidence, how they include evidence or exclude evidence, and based on what the science actually says, whether or not certain theories have been testable and verified. But what has happened under the updated version of this manual is climate activists have burrowed in an effort to try to have judges separate themselves from the scientific method, and to say, and you have the names of very prominent activists burrowing into this manual, saying that the science is settled, that the alarmist position is the correct position, all in an effort to sabotage this initiative to repeal the endangerment finding. So judges can be convinced that, oh well, according to the science, we have to regulate CO2 for reasons of public health and for reasons of averting a climate catastrophe. And the letter from these scientists addressed to Chief Justice John Roberts is encouraging him to go back to an older version of the manual that says that, scientists is about debate, about testing hypotheses, that there is no certainty on climate, and that you should admit or exclude evidence based on what the scientific output actually is, not what activists say that it is. I'm sort of simplifying it a bit, but that's the letter in a nutshell. What the Chief Justice does with this, who knows? But we should be thankful there's at least a counter movement against climate alarmism getting control of the court system. And it's not just the endangerment finding case. That's the most prominent case, but there's hundreds of climate-related cases going through state and federal courts. And if climate activists can call the shots, well, that's going to be trouble for anybody who doesn't want these burdensome regulations.
Yes, and if I recall correctly, there was a group related to the ones who had been pushing for this updated version of the reference manual on scientific evidence, where they were holding workshops to educate judges. And so they would hold these kind of teach-in sessions over several days or a week or whatever, where they would be educating judges about climate issues. And they were always in this sort of activist mindset, the alarmist mindset, rather than, okay, we have trade-offs here. This is what the data says. This is what the models say. It definitely wasn't apolitical. It seemed to be politically motivated.
Yeah, oh no, it is. And I think that what that tells us is that the Trump administration is hovering right over the target with their deregulatory efforts. From my point, the great hope for me would be for the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the Massachusetts EPA decision that granted the EPA authority it never should have had in the first place. That sort of gets back to my whole administrative state kind of concerns. Since the complexion of the court has changed since that ruling, if it does work its way up to the high court, you would like to think they would overturn the ruling. But of course, it won't see the light of day if this activist kind of version of the manual gets too far down the road. So, which is why I'm glad to see that these scientists have addressed this letter to the Chief Justice to ensure that they follow the right precedents in terms of how they handle the science, and that activism doesn't supersede science. And that's the nuts and bolts of the letter. So where it goes from here, I don't know, but I would say there was a time when the climate activists were really, they had the upper hand, they had the levers of government. I think it's more of a fair fight now. So I think there's at least a fighting chance that, real science will carry the day, and the judiciary will play it straight, and hopefully we can free ourselves from these unscientific regulations.
Are you concerned at all? Like we've been talking about the different networks involved, where you have the litigation arm, you've got the research arm, you've got the policy arm, the litigation arm, or whatever. Are you concerned at all about the research arm where they're churning out different reports and studies that always support the climate alarm narrative, even though, the funding comes from certain groups rather than neutral bodies or whatever, that the so-called scientists themselves state in their acknowledgments that they hope that the articles and studies will be used to shut fossil fuels down. Is your concern about Do you have concerns about that type of research entering into or informing how judges rule on these types of lawsuits?
We should always be concerned, but here's the part that I don't think the activists were anticipating. The United Nations itself just let go of its most worst case scenario projections. I think it was called RCP 8. It stands
8.5. Yeah.
8.5. So it's almost comedic to see all these, the media organs coming out and attacking climate realists and climate skeptics. Well, no less than the United Nations itself has said, whoops, our worst case scenario does not square with the science, so we're just going to let go of that. The United Nations, the what is it called? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. There's so many acronyms at the United Nations. But let's call it the UN Climate Report, which has been entertaining these worst case scenarios based on modeling for decades. And now they're finding, well, that hasn't materialized. The science has caught up, and that the hysterical claims made in the past don't square with reality. So we have to jettison these worst case scenarios. So I do think the edifice is beginning to become unraveled. There's a compliant media attached to the climate hysteria movement, and that's a perpetual problem. On the other hand, though, you've had, let's go back to take the last 16 or 20 years of the climate movement, and the science has really caught up. All these prognostications have crashed and burned. As much as I would like to see New York City underwater, it's not. All those liberals are still running around. California hasn't fallen off in the ocean. I wouldn't object to it, but it hasn't. So that's where we are. I'm joking, but but the point is that, number one, the public, I think, has become attuned to these hysterical projections not materializing. Number two, you've had now 2 good decades of scientific evidence catching up to it, scientific observations as opposed to modeling, satellite data, actual hardcore observations versus theoretical modeling. You can put any assumption you want into a model and get the junk that you want coming out of it. And I think modeling has its place. I'm not altogether opposed to it, but I'm opposed to it being used as sort of an all of the above tool for setting policy. I would say, there's some modeling that can have reasonable assumptions and be used to help provide government figures with some insight. On the other hand, the vast majority of them are used really with a political agenda in mind and have exaggerated assumptions standing behind them. I do think, especially if you look at what, and I have this in the book too, you take a look at what astronomy is telling us about warming activity. Where we sit in the Milky Way galaxy, how the influence of cosmic rays, the solar radiation hitting the Earth's upper atmosphere. So am I concerned about media organs pumping out and sort of carrying the water for the alarmist side? Well, that's a perpetual problem, but I think it's more of a fair fight now. I think the science has caught up. You have more independently funded groups, more scientists willing to speak out. So I think we're actually winning this argument. The science is on our side. The science has caught up. It's just a real matter of getting, how willing are we to get in the mud and fight as hard as we can. And Team Trump is willing to do that. I just hope it's not an aberration.
Good point. I would say that the RCP 8.5 saying that this isn't going to happen was earth shifting. Unfortunately, a lot of the central banks in the world still use that as a baseline for the climate scenarios that they want the institutions to run,
Right.
and they haven't repealed that scenario from the sort of toolbox that banks and financial institutions are supposed to
Right.
use. And I would throw in there that HSBC back in April, it released its sustainability report, its climate disclosures. It ran scenario analyses that said, well, we don't think it's going to be that bad. We're planning accordingly. And a group of institutional investors had sent a letter to the regulator saying we want HSBC investigated because we don't think they're taking the climate risk scenarios seriously enough. They're not using the right ones. They need to use the more extreme ones. And so the regulator has opened up an investigation. So it's like, I'm grateful that that this acknowledgement has happened. But I feel like there's still a lot of these institutional investors who are motivated by other things who still want to use that as a cudgel to force banks and institutions to do things that they don't think they need to do.
I think cudgel is an appropriate word, and unfortunately, there's too many banking officials and corporate officials who are all too willing to roll over. Yeah, and that's what's happened. But like I say, given the buckets of money in an organization on the other side of the table, the foundations, the lefty billionaires, the foreign influence, you're never going to outspend these people, but you do need to raise enough money to get your message out. And that's what I see happening. I'll name a few key groups that, of course, make the media have meltdowns every which way, but they've been very effective recently. My friends at the Heartland Institute, they just had their 16th International Climate Conference, bringing in scientists from all over the world to show you what the science is actually saying and to offer some extensive commentary on what our regulatory policies probably should look like, the prospects for economic reform. There's the non-governmental panel on climate change that my old Fred Singer helped put into motion. He would be one of those older scientists that you mentioned earlier, providing the first real platform for scientists outside of government. There's the CO2 Coalition, which I think last time I looked, they have more than 200 members from across the globe educating the public and policymakers about the benefits of CO2. So, like I say, I think there's a little bit more parity now. We have our own network, our own organizations. We're never going to outspend the other side because there's an awful lot of nefarious influences behind that in terms of foreign influence, academic institutions. On the other hand, look at where we are now versus where we were, say, 16 or 20 years ago, where you never would have thought we would free this economy from all these climate regulations. You never thought honest science was to find expression, and yet they are. So I think there's been some important progress over the past 2 decades in terms of combating the climate beast, and like I say, allowing genuine environmentalism to reemerge.
Yes, and that's what I'm hoping for, is that genuine environmentalism can reassert itself. There's been such great successes, but I feel like because of those successes, they were looking elsewhere for another problem to solve. As we wrap up here, what's one kind of overlooked story, or dare I say victim of these policies, that more people need to hear about?
Oh, well, I mean, I certainly have a long list of property owners who have been victimized. There's a couple called the Jim and Sue Chilton. They have their own book about this. They live along the border of Mexico with their ranch, and they've been fighting the Center for Biological Diversity and all these different groups trying to really gain control of their property, and they won their fight. They don't have money coming out of their ears like these green groups do. But I do find that, number one, you're willing to fight. And you have your own media platforms. I mean, there are outlets like the Daily Signal and others that I work with that allow climate skeptics and realists to find expression. And also, if you can organize and raise just enough money to get your message out. So it really is like sort of an old David and Goliath story. You might think all the money in your organization sitting on the other side of the table, but there are key examples where people willing to fight back or have their own coalition can level the playing field very quickly. And that's a hopeful sign. Also there's more private institutions. So what I would say is the climate movement is not dead. I think it might be in its death throes because the science has caught up and because the public, I think, has become awakened to the cost of the regulations, how much it impacts their daily lives without any tangible benefit to the climate. They just had their, COP30, the 30th climate summit, the United Nations in Brazil, and they cut down the rainforest to have their climate summit. So, there's almost no pretending here. And then, of course, the NRDC is out to slaughter the whales while they put in their offshore wind. So their own overreaching, I think, is going to benefit us. And I think I'll try to close with this. There's always going to be challenges to humanity, whether there's warming or cooling trends. I think the history shows that the modest level of warming we've experienced has been actually beneficial for life on Earth. There's some evidence that we're heading back into a cooling phase, not an ice age, but a cooling phase where a less active sun, where we sit in the Milky Way galaxy, we're going to be in a better position to handle whatever challenges come at us if we're richer and wealthier, not if we deindustrialize. And I think that's the one theme I really want to drive home.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for taking the time to talk to me about your book and your other writing. And I will put links in the description to your book and to your articles, and hopefully the readers will check it out. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Tammy, thanks for all you're doing. We need your voices there across the pond, because I'm looking for this revival in the United Kingdom, because I want to make sure my pubs survive and that the climate activists don't shut them down on me.
Yeah, or price you out of existence, right?
Well, that's true too, right?
Well, thanks again.
Thanks, Tammy.